Well, just before I begin my sermon, I have some great news for you. The folks at the 9 o'clock service said my sermon was too short. So I promise to make up for it. I won't make that mistake twice. If you were here on Good Friday, you know that we focused the service on looking at the last words of Jesus. We took a look at those words to show us how to go on when we experience difficulties or death. Similarly, down through the last few years, people have looked at the last lecture by Randy Posh. They've looked at the letter Jack Layton wrote to the Canadian people to find in those two writings examples of where we go from here, how to live life. And we particularly focus on the words of Jesus, his last words to his disciples, to find out how we can go on, how we can live every day. We can choose to lean on God or go it alone. We can choose to help or to hurt, to encourage or to criticize, to appreciate what the day has to offer us or to complain about what's missing, to be a victim or to be a survivor. The first reading this morning was from theologian Brian McLaren. And if he is right, then the way forward is to embrace new life, embrace resurrection, make a fresh start every single day. There's a wonderful story in the Gospels about a group of people who are gathered around a pool, and they believed that if the angel came down and stirred up the pool, that the first one to get in would be healed. And so they were waiting there and hoping that they would be that person once a year when it happened. And some people had been there for decades. And so Jesus wandered along and saw what was happening, and he went up to one of the gentlemen and he said to him, "Do you want to get well?" Now, I wouldn't have blamed that person for saying to Jesus, "Are you crazy? I have been sitting here for 30 years, and you ask me if I want to get well." But I say to you this morning, that is a crucial question, and Jesus knew exactly who to ask it to. Because sometimes we wallow in our dis-ease instead of being well. Sometimes we may never be cured of the illness, but we can be cured of the hold it has over us. And so I say to you this morning, do you want to get well? Do you want to live life? Jesus said that he came that we might have life and that we might have it more abundantly. That was his purpose, for you to experience more abundance in life. And if you answer, yes, I want to live life, then I say to you, follow Jesus out of the tomb, out of the dead places. Leave your ghosts behind. Some of you have imaginary friends. You didn't give up on them when you were kids. You keep them with you, and they're the ghosts from your past that continue to haunt you. I would say to you this morning, let go and let God in. Let go and let love in. Let go and let forgiveness in. And maybe even let joy in your life. You know, joy and forgiveness and love cannot exist if the space is crowded up with guilt and anger and resentment. But it is so easy to stay in those dead places, to wallow in the guilt of the past, to become overwhelmed by the anger at someone or God, to be paralyzed by grief, to stay in the tomb. And I would encourage you not to waste your life. There's a poem by Wendell Berry called Manifesto, in which he says to practice resurrection. And he writes, practice resurrection by living, by doing things like love God, love the world, love someone who does not deserve it, ask the questions that have no answers, invest in the millennium, go with your love to the fields, lie down in the shade, rest your head in her lap, practice resurrection. Now, if you've been around very long, you know I hate reading poetry. But Dina held me down and made me read this. Not true. But when she threatened, that was enough. And it reminded me, though, of the writings of someone who I love, a 17th century monk named Brother Lawrence. And he wrote a little book called Practicing the Presence of God. And he talked about practicing God's presence with you in all things, imagining that God is with you and living your life every moment with God at your side in all of your work, no matter how humble, no matter how easy or how difficult. I think the first step is to practice resurrection in your own life, your resurrection. The Easter message is not just about the resurrection of one person. It's about us today. Now, I personally believe in a literal, physical resurrection. I believe that God raised Jesus from the dead and that God will raise each one of us from the dead. The question is, will we raise ourselves from the dead while we're still alive? So I believe in a literal resurrection. But I also know that there are many folks who don't, who believe that the resurrection is a metaphor for new life. And I believe that that's also an authentic way to be a Christian. Some say belief in a bodily resurrection is essential to Christianity. But perhaps Christianity does not rise or fall on your or my belief in a supernatural miracle. There is also huge power in the metaphor of resurrection. And you can understand resurrection as a compelling metaphor, even if you don't necessarily believe it happened at all, like I do. You can still be a follower of Jesus. You may not believe what some people teach about a virgin birth or about a physical resurrection. I think that Jesus would say, what's most important is to pay attention what happened in between birth and resurrection. His life, his teachings. Now, there are many characters in the resurrection story. And they, too, dealt with death and resurrection. And the Easter story isn't just about Jesus, it's also about this cast of characters. And so we look first at some of the men, many of whom were in essence hiding, staying away because of fear. What does that say to us about living our lives out of fear, about fear-based living? How much do we miss of the miracles that are going on in the world around us? Some of the women went about doing what they could do, preparing the body, blessing the body of Jesus. In the midst of their own grief, they still wanted to care for the body of Jesus. It's not just our souls that are important. Our bodies are important too. How often in our world, for good or for ill, many times women have had to put aside their own grieving to care for others. However, all of us need to step out of our own grief at times to care for others. The angels, they rolled the stone away. They did their job. And God did God's part. You know, we keep asking God all the time to do things. And yet God already rolled the stone away. Yes, there are challenges, obstacles in our lives, but part of faith is trusting that God will roll the stone away again and again and again. The missing piece so often is not, would God roll the stone away? Would God answer a particular prayer? The missing piece is, will we get up? And will we walk into the sunlight, back into living again and loving again and serving again? And Jesus did what he was called to do. Jesus got up and walked out into the light. God wanted to ensure that fundamentalism of the day, that political oppression of the day did not have the last word. Currently, in many of our faiths, and particularly in the Christian faith, fundamentalism gets the last word. That's what people remember. And we need to provide an alternative to that. Now, during our sermon series over the last 6 weeks, it was entitled Scandalous Jesus. And we took a look at all of those things that Jesus did that got people upset. You know, it's not a big period of time, about 4 months between Christmas and Easter? You can so easily skip from Christmas to Easter and forget what happened in between. And churches so often do that. They forget this Jesus who stirred things up, who challenged the leaders, religious and political. It's more comfortable to focus on the baby and the death. After the resurrection, Jesus encountered all kinds of people along the way. He met with his disciples. Now, I have to admit that if I was Jesus, and I know I'm not, even though some people think I get carried away, but I have to admit that if I was Jesus, I think I would have been perturbed at those disciples. all of them who seem to have abandoned him, all the people who are still hiding away. He taught them about faithful, courageous living, and yet they were hiding away. Sometimes people let us down, and we have to re-engage them. Whether that is confronting the issue, speaking the truth in love, whether it's forgiving and moving on, that too is a fresh start, a resurrection. But perhaps we can cut the disciples a little slack. Until they encountered the risen Christ in person, they viewed the world as they always had viewed the world, a world in which oppression and violence and death had the last word, a world in which they were powerless over things. But when they encountered the risen Christ, they had another reality, one that was truer and more powerful than the reality that had paralyzed them by fear. And when they knew that reality, they quit hiding behind locked doors, and they went out and changed the world. Sometimes, like the disciples, we too hide behind locked doors, hiding away in our tombs. We need to know a new reality, a resurrection reality, and come out and live again. In the end, Jesus' best and final gift was preparing the disciples to carry on. And there's a lesson for us here. Whether it's in mentoring young people, training co-workers, building sustainable organizations, whether it's doing the work of our own spiritual development, ultimately, it's about training and trusting others to carry on our legacy. Now, one of the difficulties about being a preacher is you're supposed to practice what you preach. One of the very difficult things about being such a public preacher is everyone's watching you. And sometimes I find it more difficult to practice what I preach. And fortunately, John doesn't quote my sermons back to me. However, recently I have found it very difficult to practice what I preach. In the last 4 months, I've had heart problems, had a pacemaker put in, my mom has died, and I've had knee surgery. And so it's been challenging to put some of the stuff that I say into practice. But what has helped me is remembering some of these things. This too shall pass. Resurrection will come. I will breathe again. I will see my mom again. And I will walk and stop experiencing pain again and go back to being the pain I've always been. And what about you? How do you deal with the dead spots in your life and the offer of resurrection that you are given every single morning, every single moment? Not someday in the hereafter, but real resurrection now in this life. As much as I believe in literal resurrection, I also believe that we are offered that every single day, every situation. We can reach the lowest points in our lives. We can find ourselves going so deep in fear and despair that it feels like death. And then we can find our way out again. That's the Easter story. The Easter story is this: if you believe you can live again, you can. If you believe that you can fly, you can. Irenaeus said, the glory of God is you fully alive. If you want to make God happy, it's not getting on your knees and begging. It's not even worshiping. If you want to make God happy, then help Jesus to fulfill his purpose. He said, I have come that you might have life, and that you might have it more abundantly. So where are you when the resurrection story comes to you today? You can sing, Christ the Lord is risen today, but what about you? You can celebrate that God raised Jesus from the dead, but what about you? I have good news and scary news. You are the legacy of Jesus. you're what's left behind. Is resurrection alive in you and through you for our world? Amen.